Hi, my name's Tim Fitzsimmons. I'm the reporter for NBC Out, and I'm here today with Andrea Jenkins, the Vice President of the Minneapolis City Council and the first Black trans woman elected to office in the United States. So, Andrea, tell me a bit about your first 2 years in office in the Minneapolis City Council.
So, I've been on the council for 1 year, so this is my first year, and it's been really very beautiful, but challenging, and it's all of the challenges that any big city in America these days faces. Affordable housing is a really big issue. Homelessness. We are really trying to address the wage issue, but also fighting against gentrification. A lot of really challenging, vexing problems, police shootings and those kinds of things.
What led you to run in the first place? That was, I imagine, 2015, 2016 when you first began to consider it. What was going on in Minneapolis at that time that made you think I need to throw my name into this?
So Minneapolis is one of the most amazing cities in the country, but the African Americans, people of color, LGBT communities, marginalized people don't have the same opportunities in Minneapolis as the broader population does. And so I wanted to be a part of changing that and really trying to address some of the inequities in our city.
I know there have been some very high-profile instances of police brutality in Minneapolis over the past few years. Of course, that's been going on for as long as time. But can you tell me a bit about those events and what sort of situations that threw you into as now someone representing the city on the council?
Right.
What were the unexpected sort of, you've been on the different side of it before as a leader, how is it different? What happened?
It's absolutely different. I mean, and we've had some of the more high-profile police shootings in the country has happened in Minneapolis recently, including Philando Castile, who was a young man who was shot in his car with his daughter in the back seat. But most recently, since I've been elected, there was a young man named Thurman Blevins who was shot by the Minneapolis police. And there's still some dispute whether or not he attempted to fire a gun or even had a gun. That has put enormous pressure on me and my colleagues as city council members and representatives. The community is upset. They want to have, some actions taken, and they had these approaches that I wasn't necessarily considering to be the best approach. And so I had to take a stance against some of the things that the community was asking for. And that was challenging.
In terms of city legislation, what is, you've got, I think, 2 more years on this term. What are some of your main goals in the next 2 years?
So really, I am really focused on creating more racial equity within the city of Minneapolis, which means I hope to see every policy that we make, every dollar that we spend, quite frankly, of our $1.8 billion budget, that it has some focus on creating greater equity for women, for people of color, for young people in our communities, particularly for LGBT identified community members. But beyond that, we're working on cash bail reform, eliminating bail. We're really focused on economic development in my community. I'm helping to develop a African American museum and Center for Racial Healing, so that it probably can't get done in these 4 years that I have on the city council, but we can get that started, and maybe I can get elected to another term and bring that work to fruition.
So you will be running again?
It's very likely.
Obviously, you were the first trans woman of color to be elected to higher office to public office in the United States, and we're seeing in this year a wave sort of perhaps similar to the Year of the Woman in the early 90s after the confirmation of Clarence Thomas, where there was a surge. And this year we're seeing a surge of LGBTQ candidates running for office. And obviously you blazed the trail there for a lot of these people. What do you think's changed in the past few years that has inspired so many LGBTQ people to decide to throw their hat in the ring?
Current administration has really pushed a lot of historically marginalized or oppressed people to consider running for public office because our lives are literally at stake. I also think, though, society has become much more comfortable with LGBT identities. I think that representation matters. You mentioned 2018, we see so many women of color running for office, and so many women in particular, and many of those women, either they're LGBT identified or they're not afraid to ally themselves with the LGBT community. And I think that says something for our society, that we have moved a little closer. That arc that bends towards justice is still bending. I think it's really a sort of a last gasp of the patriarchy and sort of capitalistic, colonialistic stronghold that has been dominant for so many years. I think it's starting to fall apart. So many young people, so many women, so many communities of color are getting involved and engaged in the political process, and people are trying to hold on.
Specifically for the trans community, what do you think some of the outstanding legal issues in the city of Minneapolis, in the state of Minnesota? I know obviously a lot of people still struggle. There's huge issues with the youth trans community. There's a very disproportionate suicide rate, or even attempts at suicide are off the charts for the LGBTQ youth community, and more so for the young trans community. But there's obviously issues that persist into adulthood. What do you think some of those are in your areas, so Minneapolis, Minnesota? What do you think still needs to be done in terms of a policy perspective?
The number one issue facing transgender people, and I would say predominantly transgender women of color, is murder, right? So far this year in 2018, there have been 24 trans identified.
26 now.
Maybe 20. I mean, the number continuously rises every day. But what is causing some of those issues is homelessness, which is dictated by lack of access to employment, healthcare. And so these are the challenges that are facing transgender people in Minneapolis and all around the country. And not having access to employment, to housing, to education, then leads to you being in these precarious situations, which leads to violence on the streets, right? But there's a lot of work to be done, and we have to really address these immediate issues of access to employment, access to housing, access to education, and I think that is going to help us reduce this broader issue of violence against trans people in the long run.
A few days ago, there was some data released that showed that the trans unemployment rate compared to the cis or the LGBT community, LGB community at large, is way off the charts. It's much higher for the trans community. As you say, that's a way through which people come across violent situations and unstable situations. Have you seen any programs? Obviously, Minneapolis and Minnesota is a very progressive place and a progressive state. But most states don't protect the rights of trans people to have a job and to have a home.
Right.
Have you seen any sort of novel approaches to this issue, the unemployment issue, which perhaps is at the root of some of the challenges the trans community faces?
I have. And so as a part of our 5th annual Transgender Equity Summit, the very next day we had a job fair. We partnered with the Pride organization to have a trans-specific job fair. While job fairs aren't necessarily novel or unique, but targeted to that community, it is. But there needs to be much more resources, much more focus on these real issues of employment and again training, so that people can access housing. And it's a chicken and an egg, right? It's hard to get employment if you don't have housing, but you can't really afford housing if you don't have employment. So we need to develop some supportive and subsidized housing programs to help young people get stabilized in housing, as well as training programs to access the training.
So this year at Minneapolis's Pride celebration, the Pride Steering Committee rescinded the invitation for the Minneapolis Police Department. That was a fairly controversial move. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that sort of type of action.
So it was very controversial and lots of acrimony and I think pain on both sides. The police officers who do identify as LGBT really wanted to show pride in their uniform. And I think it wasn't so much that the protesters or organizers didn't want to have a police presence. They did not want the police actively in uniform. So we tried to come up with some compromises. And one of the things that I was really felt positive about, I guess, is that there was this broad intersectional analysis around it. Because 1 week prior to the LGBT parade was when this shooting happened, Mr. Blevins. And so a lot of the Black Lives Matter organizers and other groups that were concerned about the shooting coalesced with some of the LGBT organizers, and they worked together to make their concerns known at the parade. I think we have to bring these issues to the forefront.
Tell me some of the bills that you're looking forward to most in either the city council or in the state level that give you the most hope and you think will have the biggest impact on your constituents.
One of the things that we can and should do in Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota is to legalize marijuana. I think that so many young African-American men are being arrested for possession or sales of marijuana when, over 18 states have legalized marijuana in some form or fashion, including Minnesota, which has legalized medical use of marijuana. It's overcrowding our prisons and really destroying neighborhoods and communities with people going to jail for something that other people are being richly rewarded for. So in Washington State or Colorado State or, California, people are literally becoming billionaires selling marijuana, and while in some communities other people are going to jail. So overall criminal justice reform, I think, is something that we really need to be addressing. And then again, creating some specific trainings and legislation for marginalized communities like the LGBT community, and even more specifically trans and gender nonconforming young people. We need to have housing, we need to have employment, we need to have training for these young people.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.